So he basically rang the wrong doorbell and got shot for it. It's becoming too much to hear about these type of stories just over and over and over and over again. 16-year-old Ralph Yarl, all he was doing was going to pick up his younger siblings. Apparently he made a mistake and went to the wrong address. And when he got to the door, he rang the doorbell, and Andrew Lester ends up shooting him in the head and in the arm. I think this is kind of hitting me in a way that I wasn't expecting to as I was looking up the facts of the story. And I think that it's becoming too much to hear about these type of stories just over and over and over and over again. Young, unarmed Black men just getting killed for just doing regular everyday stuff. Yeah, so he basically rang the wrong doorbell and got shot for it. And Andrew Lester, he gave a statement to the police, and he basically said, hey, I was about to go to bed. I heard the doorbell and I went to go grab my gun, grab a 32 caliber revolver. And for me, I think that was interesting in and of itself, that you hear the doorbell and you go to get your gun. Like, that really, strikes me as interesting and odd, because the last thing I think, when somebody either knocks on the door or rings the doorbell, is that, like, my life is in danger. That's even living in bad neighborhoods. I never thought, like, oh man, I need to, I've never had a gun, but it just never would have crossed my mind that I needed to be armed to answer the door. But Andrew Lester goes and gets this gun, and he says that he saw a black male that he didn't know pulling on the exterior door handle, the exterior storm door handle, and thought his home was being broken into, right? And so he said, in response, he ends up firing twice through the glass door. So the main door is still closed, right? So he fires, the young man runs away. There was no words exchanged. And he said that he reported that firing the weapon was the last thing that I wanted to do, but he was scared to death because of his age and the male's size. And he reported this kid being, over 6 feet tall. And mind you, he's only, 5'8". I think in the statement that he gave, it seemed to me that, he was basically laying the foundation. And I don't know if he had already spoken to a lawyer or not, or just might have been, savvy or know his rights. But it sounded like, we had this sort of castle doctrine, self-defense type situation, right? Okay, well, I felt in fear of my safety, and that's what ultimately justified me shooting through this door. And I'd say, man, if you're shooting somebody at, that closely, you're using deadly force at that point, and there is, some sort of intent to kill. And despite being shot in the head, miraculously, thankfully, this young man, he didn't die. But the interesting thing is that, he was able to speak and recall, and apparently be able to give a statement with some level of lucidity, even though, he had just been shot. But he said, and there are some vital differences in his recounting of the events compared to what Andrew Lester said, because he said that he did not pull on the door handle, right? So that's a very, very, very important distinction. He said that he rang the doorbell and he just waited like people normally do. So he basically said he rang the doorbell and he waited. And then while he was waiting, this guy opened the door and shot at him. And, he ends up in the hospital. He was actually released just 3 days later. And I think that's a miracle in and of itself. You get shot in the head. If you get shot in the head, most of the time you are going to die. And, he's apparently expected to make a close to a full recovery. And I just really think that that's fortunate. But he has apparently suffered some permanent physical injuries. He had a cracked skull. He lost some brain tissue, and there's going to be, some permanent scarring physically, right? But, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, I think, this kid is going to have a lot of healing to do. But, Andrew Lester, he ended up getting detained for questioning And he was released just, after just 2 hours of questioning. They're like, okay, sir, go on about your way. Yeah, so you had a whole slew of blacks, celebrities and public figures speaking out. We have a bunch of protests, right? And the natural thing that we as black people always do is we think like, man, if that had been a black man, right? So Andrew Lester, he's facing charges of first-degree assault and armed criminal action, and he's actually facing up to life in prison. The interesting thing is, the DA's office, they have not charged this as a hate crime. And, I don't necessarily see anything at this point to suggest that, that it is a hate crime. But there's this interesting element that keeps getting reported on, that there is a quote unquote racial element to the case, right? And, they haven't exactly specified what that racial element is, but, there is the obvious situation that, we're dealing with an old white man and a teenage black boy. So, based on what Andrew Lester has come out and said, it seems that, the defense angle is ultimately going to be some sort of use of the Castle Doctrine, right? And again, we've talked about the Castle Doctrine before, right? And it is a very important rule that's out there that allows you to use force to protect yourself in the home. And that's a valuable right. And I am all for someone protecting their home. Do not get me wrong at all. I don't personally have a gun, might consider at this point, right? And if somebody breaks into your home, you definitely should have the right to use that firearm to protect you and yours. You absolutely should. But yeah, you're out, under the Castle Doctrine, you are allowed to use reasonable force, including use of a firearm, in order to protect yourself from an intruder in your house. And so under the Castle Doctrine, there's no duty to retreat. And specifically, because we're in Kansas City in this case, and we're talking about Missouri, so Missouri's self-defense law. And specifically, basically it says that, you can use deadly force if you reasonably believe that such deadly force is necessary to protect yourself against death, serious physical injury, or any forcible injury or any forcible felony, right? And this actually extends to the home as well. So under Missouri law, because, every state is different, not every state has the same laws on this topic, but under Missouri law, you can use force specifically to repel a burglary and unlawful entry into your house, right? And so even under Missouri's law, in order for you to act in self-defense, there has to be a reasonable belief, right? So it's not just a belief like, oh man, I thought, I felt like I was in fear for my life. I was, in danger. So I just started shooting. No, that belief, there's an objective element and then there's a subjective element, right? Because it's going to be your belief, right? So that's the subjective part, but the objective part is it reasonable, right? Would a reasonable, prudent person, an everyday person, look at that situation and say, okay, well, yeah, your belief is reasonable, that you are, physically in danger or somebody's trying to break into your home in this situation. He has all of his rights, right? So he has all of his constitutional rights. He's innocent until he's proven guilty. We definitely should wait until this whole thing plays out. But based on what we know at this point, there just doesn't seem to be any imminent threat of death or bodily harm whatsoever. And so, I just don't see how he avoids a conviction in this case. I'm just not seeing what facts could possibly come to light based on what we know at this point that's going to ultimately save him. And so it really is a difficult situation. And honestly, I think that if everything plays out the way it seems to be at this point, and again, and this does go to show that I believe in, in everybody having a constitutional right. I believe he has a right. I believe he has a right to the best defense that he can get or that he can afford. And that ultimately that lawyer should go through the evidence and do everything that they can to make sure that his constitutional rights are protected and that he gets treated fairly within the system. But sometimes when you do all of that, in certain situations, your client is still going to get convicted. And in a situation like this, they could end up spending the rest of their life in prison. And I think that's going to be what ends up happening. And I think that's, based on what I know, what is going to be appropriate. If new information emerges that changes my position, I'm more than happy to change my position. I'm not locked into some sort of position, but based on this information, I just don't see it. I think that whatever he's trying to do with trying to say that he was in fear for his safety, I just do not think that is a reasonable position whatsoever, given the circumstances. This is a tragic situation, and I certainly, again, wish Ralph Yarl the best and his family. Again, I can't imagine what his family been going through, having to deal with this situation. It is quite unfortunate.